So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Larissa Lutsevich. I'm the head of Ukraine Forum and Research Fellow at Russia and Eurasia program here at Chatham House. Welcome to our event that will be looking at Russia's ways of weaponizing energy and what does it mean for European security and energy market. I am pleased that we have an excellent panel today. Joining me is Yuri Vitrenko, who is the Chief Executive of Naftogaz from Kyiv, and Simon Pirani from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies from not far from London. So I will tell a little bit about our speakers before they start with the introductory remarks. But just to say today that we are on the record and our event will be recorded today, and we'll also share the video recording. So in addition to those of you present today and many of you who are joining us on Zoom, and we have more than 100 participants tuning in, you'll be able to share it widely in your networks. We believe that the discussion today merits a wider awareness about what is going on the European energy market, what is going on around Ukraine, what is going on inside Ukraine. Obviously, you would agree that there is a certain crunch point in Ukraine with its relations with Russia. It's no news that there has been a lot of discussion about the possible military invasion, and there is intelligence pointing to such plans in the Kremlin. But we do know that Russia is using the full spectrum warfare against Ukraine, and energy is one of these tools that Kremlin deploys, and this is not new in a way. But it's interesting that we are discussing today at the 6th-year anniversary of Ukraine living without Russian gas, and I'm sure Yuri will tell a little bit about the journey and what it means, because when we are talking about energy security and Ukraine's role in energy transit, a lot of people in the West assume that it's Ukraine that will suffer most from lack of energy supply from Russia, but actually Ukraine manages to develop its economy and heat its households without Russian gas now for 6 years. So without further ado, I would like to invite Yuri Vitrenko, who arrived from Kyiv, to give us an overview of what is the challenge, especially of Nord Stream 2 licensing for Ukraine, for the European energy market. And Yuri has been with Naftogaz already for several years. He's been there since 2014 at various positions, but before joining as the Chief Executive Officer, he was Acting Minister of Energy of Ukraine from December 2020 to April 21. He's investment banker. He is not new to London. He spent some time here at the Bank of Merrill Lynch, so he knows the financial markets, he understands energy, and he understands geostrategic importance of it. So, Yuri, over to you.
Thanks. The topic of today's discussion is the use of gas as a weapon by Russia. And it's very clear that's the case, that Russia is using gas as a weapon. Why? Again, because an alternative to it would be using gas just as a commodity, and to do what a normal commercial company would be doing in the European market under the current circumstances. One can compare, for example, actions of Russia to actions of, for example, Norway, and can see that despite, for example, the record high prices that currently consumers are suffering from in Europe, and by the way, in Britain as well. Russia is not increasing supplies to the European market, they are decreasing supplies to the European market. One can also see that Russia is not driven by, again, commercial interests when they're building pipelines like Nord Stream 2 just to bypass Ukraine and to punish Ukraine for its geopolitical European choice. One can also see that Russia is using gas as a geopolitical weapon when Russia is doing so-called price differentiation, when it sells gas at different prices in different markets based on political, not commercial logic. So, for example, it wants to favor Serbia. They would sell Serbia gas at a low price just before the elections, and so that the politician can make a photo with Putin, basically hugging him and showing that in such a way, basically, he should be supported because Russia is a friend and they're providing cheaper gas. If they want to punish, for example, Moldova for their geopolitical choice, they would again interrupt supplies or demand immediately higher prices or immediate repayments of debts that result from unfair dealings in the past. Or, for example, a recent example of Russia weaponizing gas is that basically they're blocking European companies to provide services to Ukraine, in our case to Naftogaz, in the Black Sea for some seismic studies. So we cannot basically do some seismic studies in our waters in the Black Sea because of the Russian military aggression and the way it threatens the European companies, European governments. In this particular case, it's Norway, it's a Norwegian company, and they had to stop their work in the Black Sea. It's a very recent example because of Russia. So if it's not a use of gas as a weapon, then it's difficult to imagine any other more vivid examples of using gas as a weapon. What it means for the European energy market. First of all, it means that European consumers, as we speak, they pay much more for gas. Again, because there are other factors contributing to high prices, but one of the major factors that makes it even much more difficult, that's again the decrease of gas supplies by Russia to the European market. They use some phony arguments, like, for example, look, we're fulfilling all our contractual obligations, but it means nothing in real life, because if you look at facts, and we have some experts in this room that can support basically some very obvious facts, that if you compare, for example, gas flows from Russia to Europe this year to the previous year, but previous year was a crisis year, so demand was much lower. Or, for example, 2019, you will see that they're not basically increasing, they're decreasing flows to Ukraine. Then, for example, if you look, they would say, look, but we're fulfilling our contractual obligations only under long-term contracts. But a normal market functions in a way when there is a long-term contract component of this market and a so-called spot market, basically, when people sell gas under short-term contracts, basically, day ahead, months ahead, quarter ahead, year ahead market. And Russia is just basically not selling gas in the spot market. I mean, they decreased basically, not at all, but they decreased the volumes significantly. And European customers suffer from that. Then they don't, for example, sell gas on the Ukrainian-Russian border. There is absolutely no technical, commercial, legal reason not to sell gas on the Ukrainian-Russian border. That's a very clear sign of using gas again as a weapon. Who suffers from that? Again, an European consumer. Ukraine suffers from that. Security of supply in the whole region suffers from that. They are blocking basically exports to the European market from Central Asia, from countries like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. They want basically to sell gas in Europe. They can sell much more gas in the European market. They have basically capacity to produce much more gas. They just cannot export gas through Russia because they need to transit it through Russia, and then they would choose Ukraine. It's obvious, geographically, basically defined to an extent because it's just closer. So again, the European market is being abused by, in this particular case, by Russia's energy policies. again, European consumers suffer. The market is fragmented. Again, Europe is divided. Also, what it means politically, if we just look at the wider picture, not just at the energy market, it also means that there are some fundamental principles of the European Union that are being challenged. Such principles are the principle of the rule of law, again, or such principle is solidarity. And if Russia is successful to show to the whole world that these principles no longer prevail in the European Union, it will have a detrimental effect for the European Union. So the UK have already Brexited because they believed that Europe was more about red tape bureaucracy rather than about, again, some solidarity and some synergies, basically. Other countries may follow. Also for Ukrainians who made this geopolitical choice, this European choice, who are basically going through the sometimes painful reforms. The West, the European Union, was a symbol of something basically good. And Nord Stream 2 is becoming a symbol of Western corruption. So if, again, these fundamental principles of the rule of law and solidarity do not prevail, then Russian propaganda will prevail in Ukraine and in countries like Ukraine. Because what Putin wants to show to Ukrainians, and even more importantly to Russians, that look, the West is rotten. Again, you should not make any pro-Western choice. You have to stay in this Russian world, you see, and you have to keep Putin as the president of the Russian Empire. So these consequences are very, very serious. That's why it's a very serious threat that has to be addressed. Maybe I'm not very structured in my introductory speech, but hopefully, again, it will be better with questions and answers.
I'm sure there will be a lot that people would like you to unpack in the Q&A. And I think one of the strategic decisions of Putin since he came to power was to bypass Ukraine in its transit capacity to the European Union. And this started not with Nord Stream 2, this started with Nord Stream 1. And of course, it's perceived in Ukraine as a geopolitical threat. It has a different threat perception in Germany, for example. In the United States, I would say it's on the congressional level more aligned with Kyiv's threat perceptions, but in the White House, it's a question. So there's a lot to discuss here, and maybe we'll turn now to Simon, because you, Simon, know not only Ukraine and European energy market, but also you understand Russia. You have a book that it's called Change in Putin's Russia, Power, Money and People. And I'm sure that energy plays a key role in that money part. And, you know, it's a 30-year anniversary of collapse of the Soviet Union, and soon the anniversary of Ukraine's referendum for independence. And Ukraine was always this key segment for Russian energy market. Ukraine was the largest client of Gazprom in the world. Russia was making a lot of money, and some of the Ukrainian oligarchs and politicians were closely involved. Since 2014, that tap was closed, and I'm sure that it made people angry in the Kremlin, that it lost this opportunity. So Simon, how do you see this?
So thanks, Arisha. I'll start off by saying that I think that in order to unpack, as you said, what's happening, we need to ask ourselves what are the logics that are driving, we need to ask ourselves what logics are driving European and Ukrainian policy, but let's look first of all at Russian policy. I see a commercial logic, and I see a political, and if you want to call it strategic logic, and I don't think they always work in tandem. You've just mentioned 2014, and as a result of Russian support for the so-called republics in the east of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, sanctions were imposed. Russian businesses were basically cut off from global financial markets, and as you've just said, Russia lost what used to be its largest market for selling gas. Now, what that tells me is that there was at that point, I think still is, a conflict and a tension between the political logic, which was to annex Crimea and to support the republics, and the commercial logic. And you would only have had to be traveling to Russia and speaking to business people in 2015 or 2016 to realize how negative many of them were about the government policy, which was dominated by this political and strategic logic. So I think I think the situation now is different. You've talked about the situation in the gas market. There's a question actually about the extent to which Gazprom has volumes of gas that it can make available. It's made a point of not making any available above and beyond its long-term contracts, as you mentioned. I think at these prices, if there was just a commercial logic, then surely Gazprom would be laying its hands on every cubic meter of gas it could find, even if it bought from Turkmenistan and then sold in Europe. It's not done so, and it's clearly not done so. This has been said by Russian politicians, I think by President Putin, that not only does the Nord Stream 2 certification issue need to be sorted out from a Russian perspective, but also the issue of long-term contracts. Yuri, you've mentioned that you say that the European market is a normal market, but that's just not how it's seen from Russia. They had this long-term contract system, and along with the changes I've just described, the loss of the Ukrainian market, there's also been a transition towards sales on a market basis, which people within Russian government don't like. I'll just talk about one other way in which these two logics work either with or against each other, and that is about what will happen after 2024 when the current contract for transit expires. I think that Nord Stream 2 will be in operation. We'll see whether the German regulator agrees to it working at 100% capacity or not. But in that case, we'll either have a new long-term contract, which is what's been advocated by the US government and the German government, or we'll have a midway situation of Gazprom booking what capacity it needs on a short-term basis, which is exactly what it's doing in Poland at the moment since the expiry of the contract there, or there'll be no transit at all. Clearly, if there was a commercial logic operating, let's say that the political and strategic tension somehow decreases, clearly the logical commercial thing for Gazprom would be to use the capacity to have it available, even if these they have this other pipeline capacity, and let's say that demand for Russian gas in Europe is low, on the lower side of the projections. They would still want that capacity in order to, what if a pipeline goes down and they need spare capacity and so on. But clearly, as you've said, we're not working just with a commercial issue. We're working with a political and strategic logic in Russian policy as well. Now, we said we would also talk about Ukrainian energy policy. So I'm going to change the subject slightly, because I think actually for Ukraine, this gas issue is part of some larger long-term energy policy issues. And there's actually been a real development, I'd say, of energy policy discussions in the last few years. We've had the energy strategy to 2035. We've got Ukraine's commitments under the Energy Community Treaty, commitments under the Paris Agreement. The energy intensity of the economy is being discussed really for the first time, which is good. The focus is on electricity. Just 3 points I want to make. First, the coal phase out, which arises from Ukraine's agreements with Europe. There's a national emissions reduction plan. There are targets there that Ukraine is in danger of missing, that people in the Ukrainian parliament say should be pushed back further. And there's the lobbying power of companies that own coal-fired power stations. I think it's very important that that goes ahead. It's a climate issue. It's an issue for those communities that are reliant on coal. There's got to be a so-called just transition has got to be put in place. What will replace the coal-fired electricity capacity is another question. At present, there seems to be a revival of support for nuclear in Ukraine. That wouldn't be my choice. I think the emphasis should be on renewables, where there's huge scope for development. There may well be more need for gas for electricity, but then that's got to be balanced against the gas for heat, which is consumed in huge quantities and still in Ukraine and in a very, very inefficient manner. Now, Ukraine is now in receipt of a lot of advice from its international partners. So we're here at the intersection of Ukraine and its international partners. So I've just got an example of a good idea and an example of a bad idea that Ukraine is getting from its international partners. I think a good idea is the proposals from US aid on heat sector reform for precisely the reason I've just said. I mean, 9.8 BCM of gas was used by the heat sector in 2020. That's a lot. And it's used very inefficiently. A lot of it is not paid for. 48 billion hryvnia last year was the accumulated debt. That's $2 billion. This is an accumulated problem. This is a reform problem. Ukraine is not the only country that suffers for it, but these are the sort of issues that need to be solved. And that money is on the same scale as the money that Ukraine would lose if all gas transit stopped. I mean, we are talking about, over a period of years, billions of dollars. And finally, an example of a bad idea that Ukraine is being presented with by its partners is green hydrogen for export. The UN Economic Commission for Europe has produced a lot of work on this. The idea is to produce electricity from solar, wind, or biofuels, electrolyze water to produce the hydrogen and export this hydrogen to European countries. This leaves out the fact that the first priority with renewable electricity in Ukraine should be to put it into the grid to reduce the requirement for coal-fired generation. And it also leaves out the second point, that Ukraine currently produces 1 million tons or so a year of so-called grey hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from natural gas, and the carbon is combined with oxygen and goes straight into the atmosphere as CO2, which is bad. And if there's any spare green hydrogen, it should obviously substitute for that grey hydrogen, which is mostly used to produce fertilizers. So I think that that's an example of Ukraine's international partners deserving fairly sound criticism for giving advice which might serve the European energy agenda, but certainly doesn't serve the Ukrainian economy or climate goals. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. And it's good that you brought in Ukraine's domestic dimension, because one way or the other, if Ukraine wants to be an integral part of the European energy market, we have to be perceived as reliable, transparent, efficient partners in that field. I'm sure Yuri has a lot to say on that domestic front and reform, but maybe and you'll be able to comment on what Simon also said. I would like also to invite our audiences in the room to think if you have any questions, and also online. I start having some questions, so when I look on the screen, I'm not on my Facebook, I'm just checking questions that are coming from the audience. So please do, ladies and gentlemen, send your questions online. I'll be taking them both. But maybe, Yuri, before we kick on to the audience, I'd like to ask about that US-German efforts on the side of ensuring Ukraine's energy security. That agreement in July, famous or infamous, depending on where you sit, people view it.
Efforts or a statement?
The statement, yeah, the statements and some efforts that are, undertaking following that. Well, first of all, this kind of trade-off where it's offered for Ukraine as a compensation, the Green Energy Fund, and also Germany's mediation to ensure that Ukraine's transit continues at a sufficient level, whatever this sufficient means. So I wanted to ask you, how do you assess that partnership? And do you see it as the real German leadership? Perhaps you see something in the new coalition agreement, perhaps you know it from your sources. Are you expecting that German leadership, and what kind of leverage they have to ensure this sufficient level of transit?
I'm probably very bad at irony, because I thought that I asked this question with a very recognized irony in it. Apparently not, when I asked if it was a statement or an effort. The point is that it's very difficult to see any kind of tangible effort, or at least any tangible result coming out of this effort. So there is a statement, but currently it's more like an expression of some kind of political will or desire that, for example, transit should continue through Ukraine. Again, we all wish for that, but it depends on Russia, and Russia unfortunately understands only a language of strength. And the real question, if Germany and the US if they're ready basically to speak this language to Putin, because if they're not ready to confront this aggression coming from the Russian side, then we can all express our desires, but I'm not sure that it will lead to anything. But being more precise, for example, about this green fund. So first of all, even Germans don't call it a compensation, and that's a good thing. Because Nord Stream 2 is first and foremost a security threat for Ukraine, and no economic compensation can compensate for this increased, for example, risk of a full-scale war coming out of Nord Stream 2, or increase the risk of even some kind of political, not unrest, but political changes inside Ukraine, and not just Ukraine, the whole region, coming out from the fact that Nord Stream 2 is being perceived as a symbol of Western corruption, you see, because it undermines the appeal of pro-Western reforms. But again, let's be more specific. So, for example, even with this green fund that people are talking about, so it's about $1 billion or euro, something like that.
Estimated.
Yeah. At the first
desired.
kind of, tranche is like 175 or something like that euros. Currently, Ukraine spends about $2 billion every year, like real money, on subsidies for renewable energy producers. Every year. So basically, this kind of first tranche is like 1 month of these subsidies. And by the way, when we talk that, look, we have to decarbonize, we have to switch from coal, again, it's not just about a desire. It's about money to finance this transition. And again, as I'm saying, Ukraine is spending money. It's not that we're talking basically about some green transition. By the way, Ukraine is overachieving in terms of developing renewables, again, solar and wind. If we look at our commitments and our plans, we have more solar and wind in the energy mix and as a total, as it was planned basically, and that we committed to. But we're spending a lot of money on it. And in order to continue this transition, in real life, not basically just in declarations, we need to spend more money, and transit revenues is a very important source of this money. So again, we get roughly the same $2 billion in transit revenues every year that we spend on these subsidies on energy transition. So that's the point. And also just to show that we are walking the walk, we're not just talking basically, is like when, for example, in 2014, when Russia interrupted gas supplies to Ukraine, hoping that we would be on our knees, basically begging to take us back to the Russian world. Again, we managed to organize gas flows from the West. And by the way, the first pivotal or tipping point negotiations took place here in London. I came here to London to negotiate with a Norwegian company. You may guess the name of it, but it's public. It's Statoil, basically at the time. Now it's Equinor. The trading operations are here in London, by the way, not in Norway. The contract was signed, but it was more like a ceremony in Norway. But all the negotiations took place here in London because, again, it was like a hub. It just shows the strength of a market. So we negotiated, basically, we got these deals, we proved ourselves as a reliable partner. We managed to decrease consumption of gas by households by 40%. You cannot see it in any country in Europe, basically, 40%. And it allowed us to reduce imports like 3 times. So now we're importing roughly 10 BCM, it used to be 30, and before it was 55, and before it was over 100 billion cubic meters of gas. So again, we are walking the walk. But it's possible only basically if we continue again financing this transition, and only if our international partners are really engaged.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in the audience. If any of you have a question, if you could please raise your hand. There's a microphone, introduce yourself, take off your mask. There's a lot of procedural things going on. Don't be shy. Yes, here, please, gentlemen.
Hi, Barnaby Pace from Global Witness. I really appreciated the kind of climate-centered comments from Simon, and looking down the road, not just in the next couple of years, but the next few decades. One of the big, perhaps more kind of vision rather than reality moves that Gazprom has announced is one to become one of the biggest blue hydrogen exporters in the world. As Simon said, blue hydrogen is the idea of CCS being tapped onto hydrogen production. And European gas companies have really promoted the idea of using hydrogen, including blue hydrogen, very widely, including sectors that, frankly, would be very inefficient to use hydrogen in, like home heating, which is vastly less efficient than electrification technologies, by and large. How do we make sure that we're not in the same situation in a few decades' time where Europe is importing its energy still from Russia through the medium of something like blue hydrogen, which probably wouldn't satisfy climate demands, because it's blue hydrogen in some cases is worse than coal for the environment, despite being marketed as a clean technology. But there is a commercial logic for gas infrastructure owners in Europe and the politicians who back them to maintain our current kind of gas dependency. But this continues the situation of dependence on foreign energy supplies.
Thank you very much. So in a way, does it matter what kind of energy source we depend on, whether it's gas or blue hydrogen? Maybe Simon and then Yuri.
Well, you're touching on obviously huge issues about European energy policy, and I'm not going to sit here and try to advise the government of this country or any other country about what they should do. They all spend lots of time discussing that. But if the priority is decarbonization, I mean, it's absolutely clear that basically there's a good way to go, which is renewables, and there's a much more problematic way to go, problematic for all kinds of historical reasons, which is nuclear. Those are the obvious ways of producing electricity, and the systems are going to need more electricity in any kind of scenario. So if anybody was asking me, I'd say, put 100% of the emphasis on renewables. I think that the possibility of using gas infrastructure for hydrogen is it's extremely problematic. The issue of whether blue hydrogen is actually any less carbon intensive than just burning natural gas is also a big question mark. And while you've allowed me to speak, Arisa, I'm just going to come back on a couple of things that you already said, if you'll allow me. First of all, reverse flow. I'll take your point that you were there when it happened. I just think it's important to say that the reverse flow trade actually, and this goes to my point about commercial logic and political logic, right? The reverse flow trade started in 2012 when under President Yanukovych's government, because there was a commercial logic, because Ukraine saw the possibility of accessing gas at European market prices, which were lower than the long-term contract prices that had been agreed in 2009 with Gazprom.
Not really. Because they were buying even at higher prices, but because they were able to refund VAT through such basically a scheme, they were doing it. So devil is in details basically, and there were some marginal volumes that did not make any difference, and not in winter basically. And again, it was a way for DTEX and other exporters, again, as I said, just optimized their taxation.
Okay, but in
Ukraine, usually things, or not usually, often, not as they seem.
Okay, but in 2013, the fact remains that a large proportion, I can't remember what proportion, of Ukraine's gas was imported not from Russia, but as reverse flow. Well, we'll have to agree to disagree about that. I've got one more thing I want to come back at you on, which is about you're saying, and you're not the first one who said it, there's a number of Ukrainian government officials have said that if a long-term transit contract is not signed after 2024, the danger of all-out war would increase. And again, to go to my point about political and commercial logics, I mean, I have to question that. First of all, there was massive military action in 2014 under circumstances where there was a long-term contract. The Ukrainian army has the Ukrainian army has not been shy to the Russian army, sorry, has not been shy to do all these exercises which you've seen in recent weeks, and has not been made shy on account of the fact that a long-term contract is in place. So I think, you know, we have to because this is very, very serious, as we all know, I think we have to take a very sober look at the issues. I think that what we've seen with Poland is that Poland is able to live without the contract arrangement it had before. It's not anybody's choice. That's the way that things have moved. I think that, as Arusha said at the beginning, Ukraine has found itself able to live without direct Russian imports of gas. I think Ukraine can find a way to live without the transit. There is something that it definitely loses, and you've talked about it, and that's money. And that's money when a lot of harsh decisions have to be made about how money is spent. And I'm not making light of that at all. But I think we should say that that is the main impact. And I believe me, I am as cynical as you about the promises in the German-American declaration. But I think that the real loss that would come out of not having a long-term transit contract would be money. And that's the problem we should be discussing. I think I don't think the danger of further military conflict is negligible. I think it's extremely serious. And I think these things are related, but I think in this respect, they're separate.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting would be maybe, Yuri, to hear from you how situation today is different from 2014. There have been a lot of discussion in the international media about Putin's goals and how he has to finish unfinished Ukrainian business. And Nord Stream at that time wasn't in place and wasn't an alternative to Ukrainian transit. But Yuri, how would you like to make a case for geopolitical importance of Ukraine's transit beyond funds and money?
I will, that's exactly what I wanted to say, and to answer Simon's statements or questions, whatever, on what we're losing, basically. You see, Simon, yes, we're losing money, for example, because transit volumes are much lower than previously, but probably you have never heard me complaining about that. But what we're losing as we speak, like it's lives of our soldiers in Eastern Ukraine, because they're being killed basically by Russian forces and pro-Russian separatists. We lost our territory. Like imagine you losing Scotland or Wales, basically. That's what we're losing. Again, losing money, it's a pity thing, but again, we can live with that. What we are not happy and we cannot basically just put up with is basically losing lives of our people and our territory, our land. And that's the risk what we're talking about. Because if there is no flow of gas through Ukraine, it means that it's much easier for Putin to launch basically a full-scale war and to finish this unfinished Ukrainian business, basically. Because then revenues of Russia won't be affected. European consumers won't be affected because Russian gas will go through Nord Stream 2. What we will hear is some deep concerns from European politicians. It won't change basically Russian policy or Russian military aggression. And it's very different from a situation right now when there is a flow of gas through Ukraine. A full-scale war will immediately mean not just basically Russia getting less revenue, but European consumers will basically get less gas. It will lead to a crisis in Europe. It won't be enough for European politicians just to express deep concerns. So at least basically, it's one of the important deterrents to a full-scale war. And the full-scale war, it's a critical risk for Ukraine, but not just for Ukraine. I believe that for entire region. That's the kind of risks we're talking about.
Okay, I mean, but I don't want to take up the time, but with Auricia's permission, what I want to do is not to minimize the risk of war, which I see as deadly serious, and I understand everything you've said about that. I want to question whether that risk really depends on the gas transit. I don't think it does. I think what we have is a longer term story of Russia actually not being a great power anymore, of Russia's economic decline. Russia has done terribly economically in all respects. It is in many respects reduced to an exporter of raw materials, oil, gas and minerals, to the world market, which was not the plan after the breakup of the Soviet Union. President Putin has played that hand with political and strategic weapons, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014 was part of that. All the tension, the continuing tension with Ukraine is part of that. I don't want to minimize that, but I think the configuration, the way that links to these gas problems, I see slightly differently, but I don't want to take much more time.
Point taken, Simon. There's a question here, gentlemen.
Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute. I see my past life flashing before my eyes since I've suddenly realized that 40 years ago, when I started what was then called the Energy Programme at Chatham House, the first thing we did was to debate the Reagan sanctions against the Urengoy gas pipeline. But that wasn't the main point of my intervention. Yuri, we can, and you have, debated the point about what the cessation of transit may lead to in terms of hostilities. But if I were you, I would accustom yourself to the future of Naftogaz without transit. Because I think the future of Naftogaz, even without transit, could be very bright. I would be more concerned about governance, and I'm thinking about supervisory boards which seem to have either resigned or been fired, both in Naftogaz and in GTSOU. I think what the Ukrainian gas industry needs to do is to attract investment and to get confidence from the European energy community to invest. I completely take the point that reforms have succeeded and have been significant, but I think there is much to do, and I think focusing on that rather than on some disaster resulting from the future of transit is a better strategy.
Yeah, it's interesting. Absolutely, you'll get to that. I think it's important also to think how Ukraine can hedge its risks by making Ukraine transit system integral part of the European transit system. Obviously, if there were a lot of German, French, and Italian investors in Ukraine, they would be ringing alarm bells today in their capitals about what is going on Ukraine's eastern border. So obviously a question of governance was also raised in the recent IMF memorandum. So how would you answer to that? What's your commitment to that governance reform?
It's very easy for me to answer because I was the one who, together with Andriy Baitsun, started this corporate governance reform back in 2014. And we were like drivers basically to bring the first supervisory board to Naftogaz in 2015. In 2016, I guess, it was appointed. So that's why, again, I feel myself to some extent even responsible for the corporate governance reform that we have back at Ukraine. But at the same time, you mentioned that, for example, the previous supervisory board was fired. At the same time, you mentioned that we need to attract more investors, more investments. If you look at the facts, under the previous supervisory board, there were zero investments from international investors, as you say, or international community into Naftogaz. And basically under them, Naftogaz became loss-making in 2020 when I left Naftogaz. That's something that, of course, the government could not just take as granted, basically. So this kind of change is needed. And again, it's normal, and to some extent, that's accountability that should come with this reform, that if somebody underperforms, it just gets fired. As easy as that. So it's not even about being cynical, it's just how the Western world works, basically. So if you underperform in the corporate world, and Naftogaz is a corporation, again, you are just fired. And that's why we do need, basically, this corporate governance reform to not even to proceed, but to get back on track. We're currently looking for a new supervisory board. Finally, there is an open, competitive, and merit-based process. The previous supervisory board was nominated and selected not in accordance with international standards, not in accordance with so-called OECD guidelines. There was no open, competitive, and merit-based procedure. Maybe that's the reason why they underperformed at the supervisory board and the company underperformed under their supervision. And it should change, because a corporate governance reform should not be a cargo cult in Ukraine. It's not about Potemkin villages. It's about the real change that this reform should bring. Now, speaking of the future of Naftogaz, look, again, as I said, transit for us, it's not about money. Again, we fully agree that if we look at the future is about, again, sustainable energy sources. Again, it's about, for example, in the heating sector, first of all, it's about energy efficiency. We are hugely energy inefficient. Ukraine consumes 2 times more gas per capita than, for example, in Poland. Should we be at the Polish level, we should not need to import gas at all. Again, we should switch from natural gas to biogas, biomethane. It's much more sustainable, again, in the heating sector. And we can do it basically within a couple of years. 2, 3, 5 years, depends basically on how fast we do it. But the problem that, again, it requires not just declarations, it requires basically, again, financing, it requires engagement of international partners, and that's what we need. And when people say, look, again, you have to do reforms, but, for example, again, we wanted to attract international partners to develop the Black Sea resources. Because we need new technology, again, there are huge resources over there. It's about like 30 years of current production that we identify as prospective resources in the Black Sea. Again,
how much of the gas reserve is actually in the Black Sea of Ukraine?
We estimate that it can be up to 600 billion cubic meters. So we now produce 20. Again, it's 30 times more than current production. 30 years of production.
Export energy.
Yes, basically to the European market, but we cannot realize this potential because Russian military ships, you see, because Russia as an aggressor basically blocks us from doing that. And Norway is afraid of Russia. Again, and they basically, their Norwegian company cannot get permission, a license from the Norwegian government to do the seismic studies in the outer shelf and in the so-called deep waters. So they managed to complete the seismic studies on the so-called inner shelf. And over there, by the way, we will attract international partners and international investors to do it together. We have some perspective negotiations, and I'm pretty optimistic about that. But for example, if we look at something a little bit more complex and a little bit more promising, immediately, basically, Russia steps in and doesn't allow us to realize this potential. A similar situation with tight gas in eastern Ukraine, where they basically use Russian propaganda, again, to block us from producing tight gas over there. Again, we see a huge potential in, for example, biogas and biomethane, as I said. Let's see, basically, hopefully Russia won't be able to block us from realizing our potential, because territory-wise, we're the largest country in Europe. So we are a huge agricultural power, so we can basically use agricultural waste, any other type of waste, to produce biomass and biogas and biomethane. So that's something that we should be working on. Solar and wind, we're also basically, again, we're investing in a company, and there are other investors in Ukraine. Because of the very large territory and relatively cheap land, it's much more much cheaper, basically, and much faster and much more efficient to have solar and wind farms in Ukraine compared to continental Europe. So again, in Western, in Britain, basically in Germany, in France, it's just much more expensive. People don't want to ruin their views, basically, with some wind farms. I mean, that's why, again, Ukraine is probably, it's very, again, promising in terms of developing renewables in Ukraine, consume it inside Ukraine, produce electricity out of renewable sources, produce green metals out of renewable energy, and exporting green metals to Europe, or exporting green energy in the form of green hydrogen, green ammonia, and through other energy media.
I mean, I have a feeling increasingly that there are a lot of midterm to long-term prospects for Ukraine, but we're still in this short-term crisis where for all of this to happen, we need Ukraine to be on a solid track of attracting investors, of having space to build rule of law in Ukraine, rather than being under the shotgun of the 100,000 Russian troops that are on the eastern border. And that causes, you know, a lot of political anxiety, a lot of turbulence inside Ukraine. And between now and April, we may see all kinds of events that may dissuade these very foreign investors that we want to come to be part of Ukrainian economy. But I know that Yuri is going to Brussels after London. So maybe, Simon, when you look at the way Ukraine is trying to plug itself into the European energy market and European energy security, what is missing in this discussion? Or you are pretty satisfied with the way the integration goes on?
I think Naftogaz and the subsidiary Ukretransgaz that takes care of storage, and GTSOU last year showed their capacity for taking advantage of a business, of an opening for business, because of when the pandemic arrived, the European gas, I mean, it seems like an age ago now when the prices are crazy like they are at the moment. But at that time, the prices were very low, the gas storage in Europe was full, and the companies worked together. They made available to European companies the storage capacity, which is, you know, it was built there because that used to be the border between the Soviet Union and everywhere else. It's huge, and, you know, they did an absolutely fantastic job. And I think that was a practical step which made that integration go forward. And I think, Yuri, you're right. I mean, the integration of Ukraine into the European market in that way could and should continue. And I think that is the key to solving a lot of these short-term problems. I think I think the heat sector, you say it can be done in two or 3 years, but I'm sure I remember people saying that 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, because actually, I mean, I think that one is really tough because it requires the various ministries all to work together and the various companies, and we all know how difficult that is. I'm not just talking about Ukraine, that can be in any country. I think the other thing is something that came out of your exchange with Jonathan, which is about the upstream. I mean, I do think that it's largely an effect of the 2014 conflict that because Shell had actually signed the PSA prior to 2014. There was another one in the Black Sea with ExxonMobil, I think it was, and some right, and then there was the one with Chevron in the west of Ukraine. So I mean, I do think there was some possible. It looked like those international companies were about to follow Shell and sign those contracts. So, I mean, I do think the upstream is a real problem, and I do think it means attracting that investment. Also, I mean, as you know better than I do, the fields that are worked by Ukregas Vidobivania are largely exhausted. That's just the natural process. So a lot of exploration has to be done. I think Ukregas Vidobivania is doing a very good job of actually getting out of those fields what can be got out with recovery techniques. But I think, yeah, I mean, that upstream investment absolutely has to be tackled in the short term, because that will open the way towards the Ukraine being self-sustainable in gas, which has long been a sort of aspiration which has eluded us.
So there will be a lot up to Brussels in the coming months with the licensing of the Nord Stream 2, with the new transit agreement for Ukraine. Do you see there is enough high-level political commitment, determination, people in place to ensure that the new agreement will be negotiated and that all the European law will be rigorously applied to the Nord Stream 2?
Let's start from the end again. In order to negotiate a new agreement, there should be some kind of willingness to do it from the Russian side, and currently there is none. So even last time we were like again dancing in circles until basically we started the real discussion with Putin in Paris. It was November 2019, and then within the months we were able to sign an extension of the contract. Currently it's not happening, and Putin is very kind of explicit in terms of that he doesn't want to have any discussions about the extension of the contract now. He wants his Nord Stream 2 to be allowed to become operational now, and he doesn't care about certification, compliance of the European rules. Again, it's like for him some minor details. He says, like, you want my gas, just close eyes on your rule of law. I don't care about your rule of law. He doesn't believe it anyway. Second, he says, look, I want to go back to good old times of long-term contracts. That's basically what Simon is saying, but it's like turning the clock back. So because Europe has developed a more or less efficient, normal, basically market with hubs, again, with exchange trading, with everything. And then Putin said, like, I don't like it. So you have to go back like to a history 20, 30 years ago. Simon wrote extensively on long-term contracts, and to some extent even, not Simon, Jonathan, advocating them, but it was, again, how many years ago? So again, I mean, sometimes this kind of time travels are intriguing, but again, it's an open question if Europe will allow basically such a blackmail to be successful.
Yeah. So it seems like there was a certain tipping point that passed, and if Europe wants to get Russian gas, it has to play by the Russian rules, and that is actually subverting very much the spirit of some of the European energy market that was built over time, that Ukraine is applying to its own energy domestic market to be part of that rule-based system.
The climate change fight as well, because a colleague over there was talking about, again, blue hydrogen, whatever. Should they really believe in blue hydrogen, they would not insist now on long-term contracts for gas supplies. Because Putin is, again, very explicit. He said, look, you have to commit for decades of importing Russian gas. So that's very clear. And it's really contrary to climate change objectives of Europe.
Well, I guess it also comes to access to investment and technology inside Russia that is so much depleted after after sanctions were imposed after the annexation of Crimea. So the question...
Why would you need Nord Stream 2 if you don't have gas, by the way?
Well, because Russia's economy and kleptocracy depends on extractive industries. Like Simon said, it is really the raw materials export economy, and it supports the increasingly autocratic regime inside Russia. And I think, I don't know if there's any last minute question, because we will be wrapping up in 2 minutes. Anything else from the audience, since you've beat the brave new variant? Yes, go ahead.
Sergey, British Ukrainian Law Association. Since we are in the UK, how would you assess British input and support of the strategy in terms of tackling Russian further escalation of the energy situation in Europe? What are the countermeasures planned, implemented, and discussed?
Britain is an important ally, and Boris Johnson again demonstrated to some extent some kind of brave behavior. So he doesn't look like he's afraid to confront Putin, and he's calling things by their names. So his recent statement about the choice that Europe will have to make, either basically to get more gas from Russia or to show its solidarity with Ukraine. That's very timely and very helpful. And in general, we do count on Britain in terms of, again, geopolitical kind of alliance. Maybe not in this particular situation with Nord Stream 2, because again, they're out of the EU, so they cannot even influence this particular process. But overall, I believe it's a very important ally, and we count on Britain's support, and we would like to do more with Britain. That's what we will be working on in more concrete terms, even like economically speaking. So again, Britain was a pioneer in terms of developing energy markets here in Europe. Again, BNP was the first proper hub in Europe. Again, Britain is the financial capital of the world, to some extent London, again, in terms of capital markets. So, and as I said, we need investments into Ukraine. And today I was meeting with some investment banks here in London. There is a big conference basically on investments into oil and gas that is going on. Tomorrow I will speak in front of them on investments in Ukrainian upstream. So that's why, again, it is important to develop this kind of alliance and relationship, the strategic relationship with Britain.
Well, thank you very much. I hope we gave you a taste of how much is at stake, and of course you can read much more about it with our analysis and the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies, and see a lot of material actually on the website of Naftogaz about internal reform and what is going on. So do follow the developments. I would like to ask you to join in a round of applause our speakers, because you don't hear applause on Zoom. So why don't we use this opportunity to thank our speakers for coming and sharing their insights. So thank you so much, and do stay in touch
Our discussion.
and stay safe.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you.